but the bodies of their sons, they keep falling. The echoes from outside.
Order to avoid documenting one another's names.
Right.
Virgil, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I guess from the point of view of anyone who may be interested in listening to this someday, it's kind of like journey to things all right, and my own is rooted in from a pretty young age of Gainonian traditionalism and dabbling in Julius Evola for a time, but never in a political way until quite recently. So for most of the past 25 years, I was more or less exclusively interested in metaphysics. So the Gainonian perspective of the primordial tradition and metaphysic.
And when you say metaphysics, you're not using it in the Aristotelian sense.
No,
The traditionalists.
it's in a kind of a Hindu sense, a Platonic sense of beyond the physical world.
Platonic sense.
It's not a branch of philosophy. It is the perennial philosophy from which all other sciences and ideas emerge. That's the Gainonian perspective. And I was completely non-political until September 11th.
And you were non-political because it was simply considered unproductive and unimportant by the thinkers and intellectuals you were immersing yourself in?
In part, that certainly was true, but also just kind of instinctively uninterested in politics. I found it messy, and especially modern democratic politics to be boring, insipid, riddled with scandal and nonsense.
Right.
And also just like, there is no party or person representing anything that I'm interested in.
Would you say there was time in American history when politics was what it should be, exemplified, true, a true form of sovereignty?
Not really. I mean, certainly early American, the founding fathers were certainly rooted in European tradition, but a kind of very limited level of that. And so, the American history of politics for me has always been pretty uninteresting in terms of ideas.
So what changed on September 11th?
Well, the September 11th attacks made me do two things. One is get interested in politics, and things surrounding politics, but also take a more critical look at normative, regular Islam, as opposed to the traditionalist view of Islam, where they're really just looking at the highest forms. Because, it was, evidently at that time there was something seriously flawed with Islam. And in any case, went through a kind of a libertarian phase, like many people in the alt-right, fan of Ron Paul, and then somehow just was kind of unaware of the overlap between kind of traditionalism and right wing. Even again, I'd read quite a bit of Evola, but was pretty uninterested in the political aspects of Evola. I was more interested in his writings on Buddhism and alchemy, and certainly his critique of the modern world, but didn't really find his attempts to funnel Italian fascism into a real tradition that interesting. But there's definitely a trajectory, running from Evolian traditionalism to the modern day alt-right. And websites like altright.com, Countercurrents, and to some extent the Occidental Quarterly brings some of those things out. So I remain today sort of, I have one foot in those camps of the alt-right and traditionalism.
So essentially, the 2001 September 11th attacks sort of, you sort of transcended into had some of this patriotic burst. I remember you bought an American flag, and then, saw that it was made in China.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And, threw it away or got rid of it or whatever, because it's defeating the whole.
Right.
It's just showing a.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah. It's showing the fallacy of what patriotics.
How did you know that?
I remember it.
I'm just joking.
And then.
I mean, that's a sufficient introduction. It's time to move on to you fellers.
Well, I am interested. I guess you could just say, for all of us, probably somewhat had to do with the Trump phenomenon. I know that you were referring to yourself as alt-right prior to that, at a time when that term did not hold any of the gravity that it does now.
Right. I think that like many other people that were interested in libertarian ideas, one thing leads to another, and I became, it's hard to sort out where these things come from, but there's always been something nicking at my mind about race and the differences of the different humanities, the different populations of people, and how to account for that, how to explain that, what causes that, and so forth. Yeah.
But never knew how to put it all together.
Never understood how to put it all together, primarily because traditionalism at the outset absolutely rejects fundamentally Darwinian evolution. Mm-hmm. And so I had accepted that at face value, that they're not creationists either. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but in any case, once I became aware of the scholarly studies having to do with the differences in IQ between various human groups, I became quite interested in how that could come to be and what that means and so forth. And it's probably about then, that all happened just prior to the Trump phenomenon for me. And it's probably around that time that I started gravitating toward the alt-right, somewhat unrelated to Trump. Certainly, the advent of Trump fast-tracked me in that direction, because I saw something interesting in the Trump phenomenon, and the other people that I happened to notice that were interested in IQ and that kind of thing, they were all on this alt-right thing. So it's kind of where I am today.
Jack, why don't you talk a little bit about how you came to the alt-right?
Yeah, so I think, certainly less extensive of a background due partially to the timelines implicit in our lifespans. But my first interest in politics at all came from kind of an economics background, so getting a little bit into the libertarian ideas, but just kind of, just basic libertarian conservatism. And then when the Trump phenomenon started unfolding, I would say that my gateway to the alt-right was, in a sense, some of the alt-right ideas, because there were a few of those, I think, that attracts a lot of people in the alt-right when they find something that they've been just completely lied to about. And so a big one for me was feminism, and, the whole Islamic question as well.
And this was in 2015, right?
So this would have probably been 2016. Even.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so really only a year and a half ago. 2 years ago now, I guess. Yeah, so that kind of sent me down the rabbit hole. And I spent a fair amount of time. We won't mention their names here because we don't want to give them extra exposure. But with kind of alt-right type figureheads.
Some of the more degenerative people.
Some were a little bit degenerate.
In the broader.
But still speaking some level of truth that is, of course, the political incorrect truth. And all of them coalescing around, of course, free speech, which to people who have, any sense of what's going on, that's low-hanging fruit, but it's clearly obvious, and, those types of discussions are pretty easy to latch on to. And then becoming, I guess, explicitly alt-right, starting to look at the actual work of Jared Taylor and Richard Spencer, and, of course, the discussions that we've been carrying on over the past several years, learning a little bit more about genetics and just taking all of the red pills that go along with it, brings us to present day.
Yeah, I have a similar history. I was completely uninterested in politics. Up until, I guess, I was 20 or something. Partially because, young people,
Well, I remember when you were 10, you were super against George Bush.
That's true.
So it's a good instinct.
However,
probably for all the wrong reasons, but
right.
Still, it's a good instinct.
Aggressively against George Bush.
Right, quite aggressive.
In fact, quite ironically, I would print Photoshopped pictures out of George Bush, dressed in Nazi garb and things like that.
Right.
As
he was literally Hitler.
As an indication of him being evil.
Right.
Which, looking back is...
Everything's upside down.
Yeah. And at the same time, not being... I was pretty simply aware and against George Bush because of things that I would, hear from you, essentially. But felt that, had no understanding of the true one-party aspect of politics, and thus, was kind of pro-Kerry and things like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But throughout my, middle teens and up until I was 20, just uninterested and felt that, the individual vote really held no power. Really had no interest in participating. But that really all changed with the Trump phenomenon. And from the very onset of his announcement, was following him. In a way that it was an intense entertainment. Like
Well,
it was for everyone.
you're the only person I knew that predicted a Trump
Yeah,
victory.
I predicted his victory
What, was
prior
that
to Nate Silver.
Well, everyone did prior to Nate Silver, but what was that, June of 2015? You predicted a Trump victory?
I recorded a voice memo on August 7th of July, of 2015, predicting his victory and the reasons why. And you can just observe the media response and the way that he was able to geniusly manipulate, airtime and turning any publicity into more votes, essentially. And he was and is somewhat of a goofball at the same time. But his, magnanimous presence, I felt, was enough to trump, pun intended, anyone who could oppose him. Which I remember you saying at the time, that's never going to happen. It's going to be Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I gave it a 0% chance.
Yeah.
So I've clearly kind of paved the way for electoral predictions.
I don't think I told you this. The CEO of my company, on a national call, like our annual national call, with 300 or 400 people on the line, was bragging about predicting the Trump victory.
Really?
That, yeah, it must have been extremely triggering.
What year was this?
He was bragging post-election. He wasn't.
Oh,
He wasn't.
He's saying he called it before.
He wasn't laying. Yeah, well, I'm not saying that the prediction was in line with your foresight. I'm saying that.
Well, are you also saying that he somehow caused it?
No.
I'm just wondering.
No, I'm saying
Is he
that's,
Russian?
He is Russian.
Because that
No, he's not
thing.
Russian.
I'm just joking.
No.
Obviously, I was just going to say that's starting to make sense.
Mm.
Are you Russian?
Yeah. Somewhat.
It seems to me that anyone that would have predicted a Trump victory
Oh, right.
Mm.
Would have to have,
would have had to have been Russian,
at least,
because they're the only ones that knew.
right, colluded in some form with Russia.
Over the past 2 years, at any point, have you identified as Russian?
I identified as Russian once I created a Twitter account, and I saw, that they were all really just Russian bots.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of felt some kind of kinship with that.
Yeah.
Bot kinship.
A large portion of our family is Russian bots, so we don't counter-signal them.
The only difference between our evolution into the alt-right is that I kind of skipped, because of you, the alt-right aspects of it. So when you first started talking about identifying as alt-right politically, you already knew about these figureheads, and
Right.
and I remember a conversation you said, like, you gave me a list of names of who would be worthwhile to follow and idolize to some extent. And Richard Spencer was on the top of that list. Jared Taylor, people like that, and started reading about biology and the Jewish question. It all just unfolds from there.
I mean, there was a moment for you. I was just remembering we were in a car driving like a long distance, and I had just heard about that weird blog that was the Iron Legion. Is that what it was called?
That's right.
And so those guys were kind of the first kind of modern day alt-right inkling, and they had mentioned some alt-light.
That's right. Now,
Because at that time, really, there wasn't an alt-light and an alt-right. It was really just a bigger tent.
yeah, I mean, it's people that we would now refer to as alt-right.
As alt-light, you mean.
That as alt-right.
Right. Only because they counter-signaled against the alt-right, honestly. I don't think there would be any distinction, even today, had those people not strenuously counter-signaled.
Sure.
Against, people like Richard Spencer and just
Yeah, and
calling, basically calling them racists.
And it's only as Richard has taken the movement in the direction that he sees fit, because he is the prominent leader, in my opinion, that these other people have either been forced to, like Greg Johnson. I think he probably feels somewhat forced to countersignal Richard Spencer, but other people who are just intrinsically less intelligent.
Or they're mercenaries.
Right.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Some of them are smart, I believe.
Yeah, some of them are smart. They're mercenaries, or just
people like.
I mean, do you mean like in the sense that they've established themselves? They've got their financial stream is
Right.
kind of locked into not being a racist,
Right.
is essentially.
And I think of it as mercenary because they're still under the same guise, or they're trying to act like people in the alt-right that are truly fighting the good fight. That's their whole shtick, I guess. They're portraying themselves as doing this altruistic, standing up to the man or to society or whatever. But then they're clearly staying mainstream enough to still be able to make money.
Right. I mean, really, they're just kind of neoconservative Republicans with maybe an anti-feminist aspect to them. If you think of people like Cernovich in particular, and he has an enormous following, I assume, still.
Mm-hmm. It's true. I mean, anyone that I'm sure doesn't consider themselves to be alt-right, but that we would define as such, truly are the ones able to produce an income from what's going on. People like Lawrence Southern and Cernovich and Posobiec and so forth.
I mean, yeah, Posobiec, however you say his name. There's a large spectrum. I consider people like Lawrence Southern and the gaggle of girls that does things to be on the far right of the alt-right.
Right. And you also, for a certain period of time, feel like you should give them time or credit, or they'll come around, that kind of perspective. But as they don't, they kind of form themselves more and more into stagnant alt-right.
Yeah, you can get locked into a paradigm, especially if you're, it's very easy especially if your income stream is connected to ideology in any way. It's pretty hard to move beyond your income in a way. It's an unfortunate reality of living in the world. But it would also help if the alt-right wouldn't be so divisive and unscrupulous at times. For people like the Lawrence Southerners to move into the alt-right.
Well, yeah, they're unwilling to either verbalize publicly or accept certain truths that you simply have to.
Right, I understand that.
But it's courageous and inspiring when one does, such as Paul Mellon. He took an interesting trajectory.
I would say Baked Alaska is almost a better example because he was in that realm of being able to be successful, making the money purely off of the political commentary.
Right.
And then he dipped his toes in the water, at least for some period of time.
Right. I mean, I don't know what's become of him, though. I mean, I know he has his own, like, show now that he has people on, but I don't know what his perspective is.
As far as I know, after Charlottesville, anyone who lacked true and pure conviction simply went running. And I think he was one of those people who wanted to disassociate himself as much as he could while still maintaining some level of relationship.
Yeah, he got maced, acid washed, and then Laura Jumered.
I was going to say he needed to spend more time working on that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Laura Loomer's an example of someone who will never be able to transcend alt-right thought.
Well, it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't matter. But part of it's not her fault. It's simply genetic.
Right, but in any
Because
case,
she's heavy?
she can't. Yeah,
She's a heavy.
you talking about her breasts?
I'm talking about her nose.
Right. Well, yeah.
I think it would be worth talking about Cernovich a little more because I actually forgot that he was the beginning for you and I, really.
Yeah.
It was through reading the Iron Legion blog and seeing related blogs that I happened to click on him, and then bought the Guerrilla Mindset, and that was kind of my first introduction to Manospheric.
Yeah.
This is something we're going to be editing out, I assume.
The fact that you guys were
Oh,
involved
yeah,
in the
sure.
Manosphere
We
for a while.
literally both owned copies.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah, I remember I bought you a copy, and that's when we, all of these feelings were somewhat implicit, which is why it was able to speak to us in the way that it did.
I mean, that stuff is a good gateway.
Certainly, yeah.
And you can see even like lots of people that were in the Manosphere, just as little as 2 or 3 years ago, basically going out and date raping girls, moved towards promoting traditional marriage and family. So it is a gateway to, and it has produced some good things. And, it's the kind of thing that you can't criticize too harshly in the completely degenerate world where white men find themselves.
That's true. Although if you...
It's also a good introduction to
traditionalism?
well, what we sort of propose to talk about, and that is being a young white man.
I think it's worth deliberating on our introductions as long as we deem necessary, because if upon any eventuality that this Ride the Tiger radio becomes anything anyone will want to listen to, these things will be interesting to hear about the origins. But one thing I would say is that, I think you just said that the Manospheric movement kind of turned date rapers into more of a traditional-minded husband type. And I don't think that's necessarily completely true. I think, in large part, the Manosphere is still stuck in that, tramp in search of loose pussy mindset. When blogs like Return of Kings, that, to their credit, publish articles from Mark Citadel and about Codriano, things like that. There's a lot of substance there, but then you'll also find 5 ways to have a one-night stand or something like that.
Right. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I think a lot of men have moved, have used, just like you two, have used those ideas as kind of a gateway into. I'm not saying like the sort of the standard bearers of the manosphere have done that. I'm just saying the manospheric movement has stayed.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people have moved through it to, in the same way that people have moved through the libertarian movement. Once they realized that libertarianism, though interesting, will only work in a white, ethnically homogenous society.
And that's inconsistent with their belief system too. I mean, you can't.
Absolutely
you can't,
right.
Right. So.
Yeah, that's not what libertarianism says.
Right. Which makes it impossible. It makes it 100% just a kind of a fantasy, almost utopian in a leftist sense.
Right. It's very similar to Marxism
right.
in that way, where it's just imposing an ideology that doesn't conform to the nature of even, to the nature of good men,
mm-hmm.
much less bad men.
I think this might service as a decent transition into the woman question.
The WQ?
Yeah, the WQ. Because it's interesting how recently you and I had somewhat of a much more manospheric mindset. As recently as a year ago, I would say. When we first started living together, we talked, every weekend about, going into the city and, flirting with bar dwellers and things like that.
Yes, true.
But we've somewhat moved beyond that, and it happened also pretty rapidly last year. Just due to various literatures that we were reading and talking, just talking with Virgil. I think we pretty quickly realized the degeneracy.
Yeah, I agree with you to an extent.
Yeah,
the
countersignaling.
mind. Well, no. The mindset I do think has shifted. I don't think that we were not coming from a full degenerate
not
type
at all.
of background or anything, but starting to realize sort of the deeper, the meaningful portions of being alt-right and traditionalist, and that it's not just this kind of LARPy thing. There's substance underneath it, I guess. And I don't know. That's almost at this point. I'd like to hear Virgil's take on that, because I don't know how explicitly we've discussed this aspect of it. How comparing going out and partying and meeting women in bars versus, I guess, working manual jobs in the field and meeting nice girls at church.
Mm-hmm.
With those as the two ends of the spectrum. And I think you're right that we have moved certainly towards the manual labor in the fields. Mostly. Yeah. But we have moved in that direction. But kind of with that as the context, what are your thoughts on that?
Before he gets going, I'd like to just add that, I was dating a Jew for almost 4 years prior to any of the
Revelations.
I'll edit that out.
It's gonna be. You could probably just put like one syllable before the other.
Right. Tweak it.
Yeah.
But it's been over a year since that relationship ended, and I more and more just find a complete lack of interest in meeting or involving myself with anyone that won't be a good candidate for a fulfilling obviously you both are thinking about
One woman?
one exception to that rule. There.
Sure.
Yeah.
What, we are?
The other Jew?
There's
another Jew.
There's a passel of Jews that have flown through Jacob's
I thought she was
love
German.
life.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
But I digress.
Well, I mean, it's complicated because not all Jews are the same thing. First of all, but they do tend to be higher IQ, and when they're cute, it's it's hard to like start a conversation, and the first question is, "Could I see your 23andMe before we?"
Although, to be fair, I have done that multiple times.
No, I at a certain point, it's like, I would recommend any woman who's going to date a man to have a background check done on him, to make him like, show me a background check. I want to see. In this world where you can't, there's no community vetting system,
Mm-hmm.
and there are just so many charlatans that it's very hard to know if who you're dealing with is being authentic with you. Yeah. I mean, the entire alt-right, the leadership of the alt-right needs to do a much better vetting of people that emerge, when the Eli Mosleys emerge. I think it's a good plan to have as a standard that you're not going to consider anyone. But that's an austere, it's an ascetic mode. It's quite difficult for a young man.
I tend to resort to.
Right.
Or
And
default
I
to.
think that it's possible to. I think you have to have a certain openness in the current world of American life, because a strong man can, especially if you find even a somewhat, which you think might be a somewhat degenerate woman, if she is, when a woman falls in love with a man, properly speaking, it will be her inclination to follow him. And at that point, it's not so hard to move someone from a kind of, degenerate interests, if you will, to noble interests. And in some ways, talking about the church, going to church and finding a nice woman, that's also potentially a double-edged sword, because the church has done a terrible job in the last 200 years of protecting, safeguarding European society.
Right, it's no longer
Because
a
it's-
safe haven.
And even, it's no longer a safe haven, but in a way, theologically speaking, because Christianity is allegedly for everyone. I mean, to me, this is an area where traditionalism can help, in the sense that it sees that all of the major revelations are from the same divine source. And so therefore, Christianity is not for everyone from that point of view. It's really for a particular human population, in the same way that Hinduism is for a particular population, and Judaism and Buddhism, all the revelations. So there's a kind of providential aspect to Christianity being embraced by Europeans. But Christianity itself hasn't fully recognized that, and certainly in the last 200 years has really rejected that, and is trying to convert all of Africa and so on. And could Christianity improve Africans? Sure, it can improve them, but it's not going to make them Europeans.
As you've said before, everything is downstream from race.
Yeah. So, my point is simply that in some ways, I can imagine a young man having an easier time sort of converting a somewhat degenerate woman who isn't locked into, that doesn't identify exclusively with Christianity. Because it's sort of like libertarianism. It's in Christianity cannot ultimately embrace race realism in the sense of the alt-right. Really only a deeper perspective of the religious question, really, which I think, as I said, is an area where traditionalism certainly doesn't. I'm not suggesting that traditionalism is an antidote, is not going to come to the aid necessarily of race realism. I'm just saying that what it tells us is that all the major religions are true, come from the same source, and that the implication of that is that all the religions have a particular space and are for a particular people, destined for a particular people. And that means that there are, in fact, different peoples. And Christianity, as I said, was, really providentially destined for Europeans. For, in some ways, for better or for worse, but in some ways for worse. But you can't really go back, in my opinion, you can't go back effectively and expect all of Europe to start worshiping the pagan gods again or something like that. It's too. We've moved beyond that. And we have not moved beyond Christianity at this point. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even suggesting we should, but in terms of finding a spouse, it's certainly possible within the church to do that. But you almost have to find someone within the church that, in a way, isn't fully on board with the Christian message of converting every last single person on the planet to Christianity. And I expect orthodoxy is probably the closest, and fortunately you two are Orthodox Christians, and certainly they're more inclined to a kind of ethnocentric aspect. Sure. I was just today reading that Eric, I don't know how you say his last, Job or something like Eric Job. And there was actually, when Heimbeck... Hobe is how you say it. When Heimbeck became Orthodox, I guess, the church didn't realize his real views. And so, there's some higher up in the church, I don't know how high, came out with a statement saying, you can't hold these racialist perspectives and maintain a good standing within Orthodoxy. So that's the perspective of Orthodoxy.
It is worth noting, though, that whoever made that statement, as I recall, was only somewhat forced to do so after Heimbach developed some kind of notoriety.
I'm sure that's true, but it's also true that you will search in vain within the history of Orthodoxy or Catholicism for a truly racialist or race realist perspective.
Community.
It's certainly a community. I just mean like any Christian saint speaking on the subject. It's in large part it's because it was a non-existent issue.
Yeah.
But when they, like for example, when they were fighting off Islam in Southern Europe, they were fighting against a religion, an invading religion. They didn't view the fact that Islam was violent because the people that embraced Islam were violent. And that turns everything sort of on its head.
Right, and that's, I assume, something that Gay-Known and other traditionalists who followed him and followed Schuon and things like that are also unwilling to look at from that angle when they write about and discuss Islam.
Yes, and in large part though, it's because they are really only interested in the best, in the noblest manifestations of religion. Whereas someone like Bill Maher is only interested in the worst manifestations of religion. It's kind of an opposite experience, and and they make really good arguments that
Bill Maher?
The traditionalists, that all the religions. I mean, if you look at someone in Sufism like Ibn Arabi, or in all kinds of Buddhist examples and so on, it becomes pretty evident that they're all saying very similar things. They're all supping from the same source of nutrition. So back to what does one do? I think in your situation, I think when someone's in a more transitional phase of their life, it's also not a good idea to try to find the love of your life and have a family, unless they just appear. That's a possibility.
It is a possibility, but it can't be counted upon.
Right, and someone like Jack, who has, his life is less in transition. He's gainfully employed and so forth, and a little older. It is time to try to seek out.
And you're also in kind of an inspirational way beginning to do something that I wanted to touch on. You brought up the prospect of being able to change what might be seen as a degenerative woman into a...
You guys need more tea?
Kind of a follower of your own ideology,
mm-hmm.
which you have clearly done, which we'll get to. But
we're going to get to that?
We'll get to how you've been able to form your wife's ideology around your own. Yeah. But something that Jack does is something that I think is key that line of thought, which is just, again, somewhat ironically, that I'm the one saying this, but complete honesty.
With potential women.
Yeah, I mean, if you can either sort of seek out traditional
Not complete honesty, to be fair.
right? I mean, it's
I'm not insane.
drastic, right?
Yeah.
You don't want like knives coming at your throat.
No.
But you can either come at this from the perspective of seeking out an archetypal traditional woman who has been raised that way and who has all of those implicit.
I'm not sure I'm cool with his pronunciation of
Archetypical?
archetypal.
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 You can say archetypal or archetypal. I've had this conversation in class before.
I see.
Guys, this is a bit autistic.
Are you coughing? No, this isn't important.
Well, if it weren't for autism, the alt-right would have about 3 followers.
Certainly 3 less.
Thank heaven for autism.
Yeah.
The alt-right is downstream from autism.
Which is downstream from race.
Right. Race produces autism, producing the alt-right.
I mean, I think there's a healthy dose of autism that anyone could. I'm in the middle of
I know. You're just wasting butane.
got a lot. But what I was saying is that you also don't have to, the other thing is, with those women who are, in a sense, archetypal in their life and in the way that they, their desires for quiverfuls of children and, beautiful white skin, you can search that out, or seek that out, rather. But you can also do something that Jack has done a little bit of, which is just simply being honest with women that you meet in day-to-day life. At least about, being a Trump supporter, maybe alluding to more radical views, and just simply gauging the reaction.
Right. I mean, that's a good plan, even though Trump is really not our guy. It's triggering enough.
Oh yeah.
Well, it
to
is
start there,
because the thing is, if you're on the left, your view of Trump actually is as if he was our guy.
That's
Right.
true. That's quite true.
So
Very
in
good
that
point.
sense, if you could find a leftist that hated Trump and was still okay with you because she was okay with the blatant racism and nationalism and everything, you may
Yeah.
have one of those degenerates to convert.
That's
It's
that's
It's
true.
it's only from the inside of our movement looking out that Trump isn't our guy.
Right. No, that's quite true. It is also true that, I think most of the leaders of the alt-right, Spencer and Jared Taylor and Kevin McDonald and even Greg Johnson, I think they were all dabbling in leftism.
Oh yeah.
And in a deeper way, and that can be useful because when you start to critique, when you start to look at criticisms, you don't just accept the status quo. When you start to critique it, even from a leftist side, you will start to be convinced of true arguments. Possibly, I mean, it's a potential. If you found a leftist, which this is unusual, but a leftist who is not opposed to Trump,
Certainly unusual.
it's a very unusual possibility. But the alt-right, in fact, does have what would be considered by Republicans certain leftist notions.
Oh yeah.
It's like roaming millennial saying that she's to the right of Richard Spencer. I mean, we would see nothing wrong with universal health care and, obviously a protectionist economy and very little dabbling in foreign wars and that sort of thing, those are all anathema to Republican. The last person that I would seek out is a Republican.
That's an interesting point, because kind of how I would guide my seeking towards.
Here, I have a question, kind of a thought as well, in terms of, like, bigger picture, I guess. It seems like we're talking about this from the context of fully aligning with someone in terms of our beliefs. Is that actually a prerequisite? Because, Jacob, you were kind of saying we want someone who wants a quiver full of babies with white skin. Like, I hear what you're saying, that's kind of rare to some extent, but it's also totally inherently internally motivated, that most people do want that on a biological level. So I don't know if it's really that rare. So how much are we worried about finding someone that can align and get excited about these types of ideas versus someone who can just provide, the motherly qualities and the homemaker, because there is, the female's proclivity to the left is in some sense based in biology. They want to, these nasty single cat women want to be mothers to the unwashed masses. Mm-hmm. So that, like, inherent motivation may not actually be in and of itself a bad thing.
Right. When
combined with what you're talking about, which is their ultimate desire to follow.
Right.
So that, in terms of this discussion, is that where are we trying to land on the type of person we're aiming at?
Yeah, I back to your, starting with your question about the ideas need to align.
Right.
I don't think that's necessary at all.
Certainly not. And that's not what I meant by someone who desires some of the same things. And I realize that is an implicit biological feeling within women. However, with the influx of feminist ideologies spreading throughout Western nations, is attempting to deprive and reject those implicit feelings within
Sure,
women.
Yeah.
So in that regard, anyone who's not a staunch feminist, is a likely candidate for being at least able to develop those feelings.
At the end of the day, where a particular woman is on the political spectrum, to me is not. I guess is not so important. And what I mean by I wouldn't go for a Republican is that a woman who proudly announces that she's a Republican is typically someone who's just a regular, like, Paul Ryan kind of Republican who's already decided something.
Equally as brainwashed.
And I can easily imagine finding a woman who identifies to some degree with being a feminist, but once they decide to at least implicitly follow a man, so long as they don't contradict you.
Sure.
Politics
or deliberately disobey you.
Politics and ideas it's a man's world.
I completely agree.
And
the ideal is for a woman to have complete political apathy.
Well, that's kind of impossible today to have complete political apathy. But so long as it doesn't ever rise to the level of real contradiction, if she doesn't, fully agree with whatever idea you're contemplating at the moment. The other thing is that, we're all on a journey. Our ideas, whatever ideas we hold today, they're not going to be the same 5 years from now. Yeah. They may be along the same line, but they'll be maybe more nuanced, or we'll change our mind on this or that.
Right. Or maybe we'll have completely embrace National Socialism.
Well, or new information could arise too.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah, maybe maybe 5 years from now they'll completely sort out that IQ is entirely environmental.
Yeah.
And We'll have to adjust it, even though the 538 alleles that they just discovered that
or more possibly that the whole CRISPR technology takes off, and we're about to have a world full of 150 IQ people.
Well, they'll all be Chinese.
Regardless
Sure.
of race.
Yeah. So in which case we're done anyway.
Well, you could marry a Chinese woman.
Well, I mean, as a civilization.
Well, with
Right.
CRISPR technology, it wouldn't need to be Chinese. They could all be Negroes.
I'm just saying that the Chinese are the only one with the balls to actually use it.
That's a very good point, yeah.
And, you know, I honestly, I am doubtful of the abilities of CRISPR technology to. I think that it's too complex. You know, I can imagine that the Chinese will start to dabble in it, and they'll create some monsters, and we'll just have to see how that goes. Because I would expect if you try to move beyond, say, a standard deviation in IQ, they get to the point where they can identify how to edit it in a embryo or whatever, however they do it, and if you try to move it too far, you'll create, you'll create basically Ashkenazi Jews or something. I mean,
Which is synonymous with being a monster.
An alien.
you'll create an alien race.
You won't hear any alien counter signaling on this podcast.
No, certainly not. We don't believe in aliens.
We do believe in aliens.
That's the only explanation.
Yeah.
I would like to hear more, though, about, I guess, pontifications from Virgil. You are married to what could be regarded as an archetypal trad wife, in the modern world. But she didn't start out that way.
No, she didn't start out that way, but she, from the beginning, it was implicitly that way. Very nurturing, submissive. One of the first questions I ever asked her was what her relationship was like with her parents. And, she deeply loved her father, who was a very mixed person, but still, all of her recollections of her father are positive, and she loves her mother, and that's to me like
That's very important.
I mean, unless there's a
Sure.
serious problem, and if there is, that's another thing to, it's difficult for a young man because if a woman is very attractive, that the temptation to overlook certain problems is severe. And my own experience is filled with that.
That's smart.
And so that, this is being honest. The beginning is a great approach, and also basically being as objective as humanly possible about things like that. Like if you find a young woman who claims to have been abused as a child, for example, I mean, that's sad. Run for the hills. Just because there's a problem in the family at some level, or she's lying. Either way, it's a problem that you can't solve. That's just one example, but that kind of thing is rampant.
Essentially, you're saying to an unfortunate extent, she's been tainted.
Well, statistically speaking, if in fact she was abused, there is a history of abuse in her family, and all of the tendencies, all of the problems that we have has a strong genetic component. So if you wish to have children with such a person, you're taking a chance. If she wasn't abused, but says she was, it's a whole other set of problems that there's no solution for.
Is that common?
Very common.
Really?
Yeah. There was an
people
entire...
saying that they're abused as children?
Yeah. So-called repressed memories.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole... During the 80s and 90s, there was a whole psychological movement. They believed that lots of young children had been abused and couldn't remember it. And so they would hypnotize them and bring out these alleged repressed memories to the point where women who had reached maturity were literally accusing, particularly their fathers, of sexually abusing them and sending them to prison.
Does this parallel with the increased popularity of therapy and psychologists? I mean, I recall you...
Well, certainly by the 80s, even for middle-class Americans, going to a shrink had lost its stigma in society. And these people, this group of, talk about a fantasy, modern psychology, based on nothing, except the evolutionary psychologists, but the just, regular psychologists, it's just a fantasy world. And so they're always dabbling, they're always tinkering with new ridiculous ideas and so on. And this was just one of them, a particularly pernicious one, where they were basically replicating so-called repressed memories, of which there's almost no evidence for. It's not to say that it's impossible that could happen, just that the sheer quantity of cases where it happened. There have been, books written about it recently that, just showing how many cases there were and how many men went to prison and were later released,
Really?
found to be innocent.
Another win for the Jews. I mean, all of that
Hats off.
Can certainly be traced to Jewish influence.
I mean, that's a hard argument to make. Are you saying Freud was a Jew?
Yeah. I'm saying Freud was...
I mean, in terms of Jewish influence, I would say psychology is, it's one of the biggest avenues of undermining the European sense of self.
It's really a way for them to develop themselves. What's that?
The time.
Oh, okay. It's really a way for the Jews figured out a way to come between the woman and her European man and become the imposer and sort of master, in a sense, when you have cases of women who don't do anything without the implicit permission from their therapist.
Well, I mean, in religious terms, it's a replacement. The psychologist or psychiatrist is a replacement for the priest. And in the church, there was a man who could intervene or come between a woman and her husband, and that was the priest. But he always would have reminded her that the man is the head of the family and so on. Whereas the psychiatrist, the man's head of nothing. The family is a social construct. And it's, even if it's not intentional undermining, it's can have no other effect than undermining. That's not to say that just regular therapists don't have some value, because people need to talk to each other, and sometimes you need an objective point of view. And in modern society, having friends who can be objective is harder and harder to find.
Interestingly, one of my friends is taking some therapy right now, and it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of actual feedback.
No,
It's so an objective, like they're not getting advice really.
Right.
At least he's not.
Right, that's part. What advice can they give? That's part of it. Is like they just throw questions back at you, and you're basically sort of guided to sort of solve your own problems.
A lot of these women, I'm sure, simply just want someone to
listen to them.
gab to.
Yeah.
About their marriage. And it's a weakness they're capitalizing upon.
Well, it's not really. Yes, it's a weakness. That it's not necessarily. It's in the nature of a woman.
Sure.
To talk. She wants to talk about this or that, and in a normal community, there would be affirmation and support for your, whatever would support your family life, whatever leads to your family life being better, being, making your husband happy, trying to make him happy or whatever, or raising your kids properly and so on. That's what a normal community would help do, and women would do.
It's also what the country was attempting to facilitate prior to 1950. With pamphlets and whatever commercials and things that women would watch, they were completely antithetical to today's.
Yeah, yes, that's
subversion.
true, but
Like,
there were also
tidy the house, make sure dinner's on the table when he gets home, things like that.
right, but the commercials.
If he hits you, understand that he's had a hard day at work, and things like that.
Part of the problem with that kind of thing is that it set up women as basically strictly consumers, and eventually, once you get them to be nothing but consumers, they'll consume anything. And so it's not to make it out like it's a grand plan, but it's just a trajectory of particularly even the so-called wholesome television of the 1950s. You had this captive audience of consumers, and that was the 50s and 60s and 70s were kind of this golden age where that had never existed before and probably never will again, where women had been freed from basically domestic slavery in a sense, because their domestic life was so arduous. Every food item made from scratch, everything cleaned by hand, so forth, like my grandmothers did. Suddenly, by my mother's era, they basically had nothing to do except consume.
Which is still the case.
It's still the case,
We're poorer now.
But women now have to be in the workplace.
Right.
And in some ways that's better because they're not captive consumers. Women were always economic participants. Full economic participants in the household. That's part of what kept families together. They needed each other. Even if you hated your spouse,
Right.
you needed your spouse. And modern life has relieved that pressure, but it's opened up a Pandora's box of so many other things.
It's also gotten to the point where certain propagandists are promoting the idea of, there's no point in getting married. Children are a waste of time. It's especially directed towards whites. you'll see in by the same publication, a magazine with the cover of, a Negro couple with a baby, and it's like how to live a happy life and whatever. But then you'll see a white woman, like frantically wondering how to deal with her baby,
Right.
promoting the opposite.
Right. There's certainly a heavy onslaught to do whatever they can to prevent white people from breeding.
I mean, it's a somewhat overt, depending on your level of wokeness, somewhat overt or subtle form of genocide on the white race. One of the
Right.
many.
Whiteness has to be stopped.
Before we stop this podcast, I do want to hear a little bit more about, given your superior experience in life, how 20-somethings should go about finding a worthwhile mate in today's society.
If I had it to do over again, I honestly would seek out like alt-right women on Twitter and try to communicate with them. To me, if they're single, and to me that's and I know that there are women out there on Twitter, older women, who are being matchmakers. Seek them out. Let them know. I'm ready to settle down and get married and so forth. And, prove yourself a worthy man.
So you're saying
It's like, you can use it like almost like a alt-right dating site.
the problem with those is that they, exist on some level, like wasp. .love is
There's just not enough
exactly,
participants.
and it's also flooded the percentage of male to
That's
female.
every dating site's going to be like that. It's always going to be 80-20. And I've seen, like, there are some sociologists on Twitter that have shown the stats, like whatever the Tinder and Match.com and OkCupid. It's like something like 80% men seeking out 20% women. And all of those women are focused on 20% of those men. I mean, it's hypergamy to the max. And, you two are good looking, so you have a much higher chance on those sites. And I'm not saying those are pointless, but to me, this, potentially the easiest path would be to use Twitter in that way, because it, if you already find someone who has these views, I mean, that's, even though I said you could try to convert someone or whatever that you may happen to meet in your normal daily life. Another thing that I would do is, if it's truly, whenever it becomes or is today, maybe for Jack, your intention to find someone, make it part of your daily prayer. And what that does is it just focuses your intention on that important thing. Basically, there are two things or three in your life: that your spiritual dimension, your marriage, and your work. When you get to be my age, those things are going to be the most, and this is speaking from someone who's made tragic errors in his life. Those are going to be the most important when you get to be in your 50s. What you did for a living and who you married. So it has to be like the same vetting process, the same level of financing and interest that you put into school and getting a job. That's how important your marriage, who you marry, will be. And this is coming from someone who just you just marry who your high school sweetheart was. That's what all of us did back then, or just whoever you happen to kind of run into, and that works perfectly in a medieval society where the whole mindset is unanimous. It doesn't even matter almost who you marry in a society like that, because you're just producing your people back then. But now it's like it's become a poker game. So you have to isolate a crowd, and that's why I say that's how I would start.
The problem I see with that, slight rebuttal I'm going to make.
What?
Yeah.
That's
I didn't expect.
Cut it.
I didn't expect that.
Well, I mean, here's the problem. Twitter is a tool, but really only for people who have invested time and produced some kind of following. I've tried several times to reach out to women, and occasionally there's a response. The problem is, if you're seeking out alt-right women, which is what you suggested, and also seemingly the only way forward, if that's your approach, is they are also anonymous to a certain extent.
Yes.
You don't really know what they look like.
Right. No, I know it's a. I'm not saying it's amazing. I'm just saying that it's an avenue that exists that to me is a little bit better than trying to go through a dating site and then isolate some small segment of the population.
Do you think it's also more likely to end up being the kind of woman that you want, more likely than simply existing and in a real life setting? I mean,
Finding someone on Twitter.
Yeah.
Again, it's hard to say. It's not a panacea. I think that it's pretty normal. For anyone that's interested in things alt-right to be on Twitter, because that's where you find out about things, and that's a kind of community for people, because most people can't talk about any of this stuff in their regular life, so they need some way to communicate, to learn, to be who they are.
Right.
And that's even if it's anonymous, that's what. For most people, not being anonymous is basically you lose your job. So
that's a subject for another podcast. But another thing that would behoove women of the movement and women who are on Twitter seeking out men in the same fashion is participating in a real life manner in some realm, because that's how you're going to find your soul's counterpart.
I mean, what do you mean participating in a real life manner?
Well,
what is a woman supposed to do? Go to a rally?
Not necessarily a rally. That seems dangerous, but going to Ameren as we did, there were 2 women there. Obviously, that it's not realistic. But if more had been there, if there were as many single women who had showed up to that conference as there were single young men, that would be a real
I don't disagree.
possibility.
I don't disagree in a way, but at the same time, you honestly can't expect women to be willing to expose themselves in that way. I certainly don't.
And the women that do, that could be a strange selection bias for a very risk-seeking, male-minded man.
Exactly. I mean, it's also, in some ways, it's a little bit of a tell that the woman is risk-seeking.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, I agree. And To me, like a woman that is somewhat anonymous on Twitter is doing all. That's about all she can really do.
I mean, if the movement does take on a more acceptable approach, possibly in the form of a real governing political body, more and more women will feel willing, and not in the sense of there being a risk.
I don't know what you mean by a governing political body. I mean, somehow there's.
The way that like the Green Party had emerged, or libertarianism, or
right.
I realize that in no world do you think that the alt-right could appeal to enough normies to not be counter-signaled so hard.
They would just be completely deplatformed. I mean, if, let's say the Libertarian Party, let's say that Lou Rockwell came out as a race realist, they would, whoever owns the wherever he has his website located, they would take it away from him.
Do you think, and again, hypothetically, if everyone, let's say in America, and in all positions of power, in all facets, came out all at once without any fear of being deplatformed, again, they probably would be deplatformed, but it would be, I think, inspirational enough and a large enough group of people that communities would start to form in a more of a real life way.
Well, this goes back to this harkens back to the conversation we had where you are way more positive about possibilities than I am, and that's
I also predicted the Trump.
I know I'm
election.
I am ceding ground here. I'm just saying, asking me these kinds of questions, it doesn't. My imagination has difficulty going there. That's why I'm not.
You're unwilling to justify hypothetical.
Well, I also don't think it's certainly not practical today to say, well, if there was an actual political party that somehow garnered 7% of the vote, then women would flock to the party. All of that seems ridiculously unrealistic to me. Again, I'm the one that said the chance of Donald Trump becoming president of the United States is zero, maybe less than, if there is a less than zero. That's how I felt about it. So,
Non-being.
Yeah, it was like.
Now, I did win money on that election, too, so I want to throw that in as well.
Just from a friend? Oh, or,
Alex Jones?
Steve.
Alex Jones, yeah.
Alex Jones.
Didn't see it coming.
His son did, though. That's actually true. Lastly, what do you think from a strictly virtuistic, soul-fulfilling avoidance of all carnal, degenerative aspects of simply dating? How do you feel? What's the proper behavior to assume for a male attempting to? I think an argument could be made that one should wait until around Jack's age, until you've really proven yourself a worthy and heroic male in this world, to then start. They'll come to you at that point in a certain way.
They're not going to. Well,
I mean, I don't mean literally. I just mean, before having experienced certain things and fully developed into manhood, you're simply not ready, and will also be much more attracted to women of no substance. If they're beautiful enough or something like that. Mm-hmm. One thing is realizing that most of the things we've discussed transcend, utter beauty.
Right.
In a superficial sense of the word.
Right. I mean, plus, sexual attraction, even when the woman is beautiful, after you're exposed and after you get old, these things fade in a general way. Sorry to say. So obviously there has to be more substance, but I just don't think there's a hard and fast rule about this. Partly it's like once you become, as you say, proven, and basically you've established yourself in a excellent work situation like Jack has, it's hard. It just becomes harder to meet people. Like going to school, going to the university is, among many things, it's where most people meet each other and fall in love and get married.
Statistically, are most marriages founded
in school, yeah, high school, college, sure.
But,
it's kind of taken the place of
do those marriages
active
last?
church. I don't think there's any difference. So many marriages don't last.
I guess the other thing about waiting until you're older and then finding a woman. I don't know if there's any truth to this, but I have read leftist statistics about women's brains maturing at an earlier age than males.
Well, certainly women tend to mature faster, right?
Given that, if a male waits until he's fully developed, both intellectually, physically, career-wise, all these things, and then, at that point, seeking out a woman of a quite younger age for the obvious benefits of that, seems like a somewhat intelligent approach. Which would deny the possibility of simply meeting someone of similar age and similar interest in college, because you haven't gone through that yet.
Right. No, as I said before, I agree that when your life is in transition, to me it's more about being in transition. Than age. If a young man is going to a local community college and is locked into a community that he wants to be in, I see no problem with pursuing a woman.
That's true.
But when someone is off far away at school and
doesn't plan on staying
there, or doesn't know where they're going to be,
right.
I'm not saying you close every door. You never know what you may run into, but it's not the best time to try to, bring someone along.
Sure.
But we should probably sign off.
I'm satisfied.
The siren sound our Father you lead, but the bodies of their sons they keep falling. The echoes from outside